Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Krisztina Kopcsó from Hungary, from the University of Pécs. I'm a PhD student, and my research topic is fear of the darkness. And in my presentation, I will talk about my research about the alteration of thinking method in the darkness and its relationship with the fear experienced in the darkness. All right. So let's start with a brief introduction. Yeah. To begin with, fear of darkness could be defined as a complex experience including the sense of separation, lack of safety, and the mobilization of fantasy. It's a well-known common situation in the childhood, I think. According to the literature, is the most prevalent between the ages 7 and 9. During our recent researches, me and my colleagues identified that nearly 70% of adults fear have at least low level of fear of darkness. So it shows that this topic could be relevant in case of adults too. And of course, there is a clear sex difference. Women fear more frequent, and women fear more intense in the dark. All right. Yeah. In the recent research, we try to widen our focus and not just deal with the fear of the darkness, but with its background. So what is in the background? Why is the darkness special? And we highlighted the mobilization of fantasy from this definition. I think that is an everyday experience that something changes in the darkness in our mind. Let's just think about romantic dinner by candlelight or stories told before sleeping. So our imagination is just flying, our behavior changes, and we try to catch this situation with an evidence-based method. Okay, before presenting the research, I'd like to show you some experiments dealing with the same phenomenon. So Schwartz and Happaya examined perceptual distortions or human perception in semi-darkness. They have normal, neurotic, and psychotic sample, and they found that people report perceptual distortions, just as distortions of form or illusions of movement, affective changes, experienced and projected feelings as well, and associations and physical symptoms. Just a few words about their method. They were just fitting the subject facing an observer's face in semi-darkness and asked them to report freely on what they see, think, or feel. And that's how they found these results, yes. And there were some differences between the samples. So experienced feelings were more frequent in case of psychotics and neurotics than normal subjects, and the projection of aggressivity and sadness were more frequent among neurotic patients, while the projection of seriousness, which is not that negative, I think, was more frequent among normal subjects. And as the authors noted, the results fit well into the well-known fact: the less structured the stimulus, the more remarkable the projective factor. Of course, near that they also take neuropsychological aspects into consideration. Yeah. The effects of darkness on human behavior has also been investigated. For example, the elevation of aggressive behavior, or criminal assault, or cheating behavior in a darkened room is elevated also. And the authors usually highlight the role of disinhibition in case of these results. So we can say that these results also suggest that the darkness somehow changes the way we think, but they haven't examined the change itself, so the alteration of the thinking. But how could we operationalize the method of thinking? For that purpose, we invoked the theory of Sigmund Freud, who deferred two modes of thinking: primary and secondary process thinking. I think it's a well-known theory, but just a few words about them. Primary process thinking is mostly unconscious, non-verbal, irrational, illogical, irrealistic. It's regulated by the pleasure principle. It could be characterized by freely displaceable catexes. And to sum up, it's the free associative thoughts of dreams and psychotic states. Contrary to that, secondary process thinking is conscious, mostly verbal. Later, it's more adult. It's rational, logical, realistic, abstract. It's regulated by the reality principle. It can be characterized by bond catexes, and is the predominant mode of cognition in ordinary waking adult life. You could say that, okay, but that is an outdated theory. What is anything but evidence-based? But let me show you some experimental data about that. There are two methods measuring, or I know two methods measuring primary process. One of them is the regressive imagery dictionary developed by Martindale. This is a computerized content analyzing method. So we can measure primary process based on stories written by or told by the persons. In one sentence, it's related to the narrative psychology field. I don't know how popular is it in other countries. Okay, so using this method, researchers found that primary process is higher among younger children, among paranoid schizophrenics, among stories written by more creative subjects, and under the influence, under drug influence, or under the influence of marijuana. These results fit well into Freud's theory as well. And in his recent study, Martindale found that creativity, extroversion, psychoticism, and the frequency of primary process correlated with each other, and he assumed that the link between these traits may be disinhibition again. So, yeah. The other, I told you that there are two methods. The other method is developed by Holt. It's a Rorschach scoring method. What is interesting about that Holt didn't only want to measure primary process, but he was interested in how people can deal with their primary process. So he differentiated adaptive and maladaptive regression based on affective control. So people with adaptive regression are able to produce well-controlled primary products, while others produce primary process field responses, but with poor reality testing, anxiety, and pathological defensive efforts. And after that, he compared these two groups in some variables, and he found that adaptive regression correlates to the toleration of sensory deprivation. So basically, people who can deal or control their primary process tolerate visual isolation better. That's the point, yes. They can also enter special states of consciousness comfortably. They could be more creative, and schizophrenics tend to score at the extreme of maladaptive regression. So he found these. And based on these literature, and I formulated two hypotheses. That darkness elevates the rate of primary process thinking, and the other one is that this elevation will be more pronounced in those who report more intense fear of the dark. In our research, 78 undergraduates participated. We formulated a test and a control group with a similar participant number, yes, and the sex distribution was also balanced. We formed the two groups randomly, and every subject took part alone in a similar procedure except the lightning. So they had to wait for 5 minutes in a dark or in a light room. As I said, they were alone. We were some kind of communicating with them by knocking. So the end of this session was signed by knocking. Then in the dark condition, the subject turned on a little table light and every subject, also in the dark and in the light room, has a paper in front of them on the table. They turn it, and they found an instruction to write the story. So they write the story, and after that procedure, they fill the questionnaire also. The story was a guided story, as I said. Based on Martindale, we asked them to write a story about that a man and a woman go out on a date, and the instructions said also that tell what led up to this, what the characters do, what they are thinking, feeling, and what happens afterwards. So we asked for that kind of stories. And we used the regressive imagery dictionary, practically the Hungarian version of that, for content analyzing these stories. Practically, the frequency of primary process means the percentage in the story of words in the text, that fall into several primary process content categories like drives, sensations, perceptual disinhibition, regressive cognition, and Icarian imagery. And for measuring the intensity of fear of darkness, we use the self-developed scale. Yeah. We used SPSS and ANOVA analysis. As the dependent variable, there were the primary and secondary process. And as the independent or grouping variable, we use the conditions, light or dark, and the intensity of fear. So there were 4 groups, we can say. People in a dark condition with high and low level of fear, and people in the light condition with high and low level of fear. And we compared them. As the result, we get that the relative frequency of primary process contents was significantly higher in dark condition stories than in light condition stories. And we also compared just the two groups about fear, I mean the high level of fear and low level of fear groups. Between them, we found no difference in case of primary process. And for the first side, we could say that this first sentence certificates our first hypothesis, but the situation is a little bit more complicated because we also found an interaction between the conditions and the level of fear of the dark. So as you can see in the figure, people who have low level of fear of the dark didn't differ in the 2 conditions in case of primary process. They produced the similar level of primary process in the 2 conditions, but people who have high level of fear of the dark differed in the 2 conditions. Yeah. And what is also interesting that these findings are unrelated to the participant sex. That is interesting because in the literature there are always sex differences in case of fear of the dark. So based on that, we can say that our hypothesis was partly true, only for people who fear in the dark. Yeah. In conclusion, present research suggests that fear of darkness is responsible for an elevated level of primary process thinking in the dark, or vice versa. The direction we can't know. So it's possible that the fear elevates the level of primary process. It's also possible that the primary process level elevates the fear. Anyway, the high level of primary process highlights the probable effect of unconscious content related to fear of darkness, or the probable defect of defensive mechanisms, or effective control in the darkness. And I think that these results also offers additional explanations for the research of Schwartz and Hapaye. The fact that they found increased projection of negative emotions in case of neurotics fit well with these results. And according to our opinion, the bonding trait between the alteration of people's cognition, behavior, and the elevated rate of primary process, it won't be surprising, could be disinhibition. And our results suggest that the people who are afraid in the darkness control their primary process well in the light, but have some serious problems or really big anxiety when they lose the perceptual contact with reality, and they should have deal with these primary process. So the advantages of the present study can be that the previous studies with, for example, the regressive imagery dictionary measure dispositional, for example, age or creativity, or situational variables like drug influence. In this study, we measured the interaction of these two levels, the fear of the darkness and the darkness, applying test and control conditions. Of course, we also have limitations like sample size or age limitations. I think it would be very exciting to compare the fear of the children in the darkness and adults, what's the similarities and differences. And I would like to also test if subjects with remarkable fear of darkness could also be differentiated based on what method, like adaptive and maladaptive regression. In this study, we didn't research that part. And thank you for your attention. Any questions? Yeah? Or no time for questions? Yeah, of course. Well, in the literature, they always use that story. That's why I chose this topic. I think it's because this topic originally elevates the level of primary process, I think.
I think this is a suggestion from my side. Actually, I think you should have used a dark topic, a neutral topic, and something that is very light.
Yeah.
And then contextualize it, and then you will get more meaningful
Mm-hmm.
data.
Yeah.
Because this one
That's
is
logical, yeah. But we have differences with this topic too, so.